It's time to talk about shutter speed.
Hey folks, this is Adam, and on this episode of Straight Talk on Photography, we are going to be discussing shutter speed, or as I like to call it, shutter time. Now, shutter speed, shutter time, whatever you want to call it, is one of those things in photography you absolutely cannot get away without understanding. It controls so much in your photography, not only as far as exposure is concerned, but also the way you control motion in your photos. Do you want to completely arrest the motion, stop all the movement? Do you want to add some motion blur, some dynamic movement in your pictures? And that is all going to be done in some shape or form using your shutter time. Now, when we talk about shutter speed or shutter time, most of the time we think about how fast the shutter opens or closes. That is actually wrong. It doesn't matter how long the physical shutter takes to open and close. What does matter is the time that it is open. And that's why I like calling it shutter time. Very important. For example, I have this set on super fast shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. Okay, you hear that click click? That shutter is actually opening and then closing, but it is staying open for 1/8000th of a second. Put it down to about 1 second. Did you hear that? It opens at the same speed, closes at the same speed, but that interim, that silent time, that is the actual shutter time, and that is what counts. Today I'm going to show you a quick and painless way to understand shutter time and how it affects the motion in your photographs. Once you understand how shutter time affects movement, you can do virtually any kind of photography work and make any kind of actual effects in your images. And I'm going to do it all with this quarter. The shutter speed or shutter time that you're going to be using for your photographs are going to depend mainly on two things. One, the actual exposure conditions, how much light you have, and then two, the type of image you want to come away with. And right now we're going to talk about how shutter time relates to movement, because that movement, again, is going to be what determines the dynamics of your photograph. Let's say you're shooting a waterfall. Do you want the waterfall to be completely frozen, no movement, or do you want the waterfall to be kind of misty, that dreamlike effect? The same thing goes with your landscapes, with clouds. Do you want to pop a neutral density filter onto your lens and have those clouds giving a sense of motion, or do you want everything standing still? Sports photography, cars, anything that is moving. Shutter time that is shorter or longer is going to have a direct effect on how all of those subjects looks. And let's talk about that right now. Again, my trusty quarter. This is half of my life savings I'm putting on the line. I'm going to give this a spin and then shoot an image at 1/40th of a second, and then we're going to take a look at it. Okay, this is our image we shot at 1/40th of a second, and as you can see, the quarter looks essentially like an orb spinning. That slow, or rather that long, relatively long shutter speed in relation to the speed of the quarter spinning is why we have that blur. So let's shoot a little bit faster and see what happens. We're shooting at 1/100th of a second here, which essentially means the shutter time is a little over 2.5 times shorter than we were shooting in that previous image, and you can already see the effects of that decreased shutter time because the quarter doesn't look quite as orbish anymore. You're beginning to see some edges, and that motion is beginning to be arrested. Now, the reason for this is that shutter speed that we're shooting now is so much shorter, that time is shorter than the other one, and we're slowly beginning to approach the speed that the quarter is actually spinning. And when we catch up to that speed, that's when the quarter is going to look like it's standing still. So let's shorten up that shutter time again and go to 1/500th of a second and see what happens. Now that we're shooting at 1/500th of a second, things are getting really interesting with our little quarter friend here. This is 5 times faster than our previous shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. That means that the amount of time that the shutter was open was 5 times shorter than the previous exposure, and you can really see that if you zoom in on the quarter. You can notice a little bit of motion blur here on the very peripheral of the quarter, but we're beginning to make out some of the actual the stamping and the text that are on the coin itself. So that motion is really starting to stop, and we're going to bump up the shutter again to 1/1000th of a second, and things are going to get even better. All right, we're getting really close now to having a static quarter. I'm going to zoom in here. We're shooting at 1/1000th of a second, which is twice as short of a time as the 1/500th second exposure. And you can see here at the edges, the motion is still there, but just slightly. We can even see the perforations on the very perimeter of the quarter there. So we're getting really close to freezing the motion, and I think if we bump this shutter up to 1/2000th of a second, we're going to freeze it entirely. Okay, I know it's a little dorky to say this, but whenever I see the actual core principles of photography being played out, it is just so exciting. I love seeing things like this. Here we have the quarter at 1/2000th of a second, and when we zoom in, it might as well just be sitting there on the table with us taking a picture of it, because even though the quarter is spinning at what we'll call the same speed as it had been in the previous shots, whatever speed that is, it is either slower or no more than 1/2000th of a second in its turning. Whatever speed that may be, 1/2000th of a second can completely arrest that motion. Now, what does this mean for us with our pictures? Well, that means that if you can catch up to any object, it could be anything really, no matter how fast it's going, you can actually freeze it, stop the motion, or perceivably stop the motion, just by setting a shutter speed that is as fast or faster than that object. If you want to add a little bit of motion, a little bit of dynamicness to your image, you can dial back that shutter speed, keep the shutter open a little bit longer, and selectively choose how much motion you want to impart in your image. And shutter time, as it relates to motion in your photographs, really is that simple. And that's it, guys. Understanding shutter speed and how it relates to motion and what you can do with it in your photography really comes down to understanding that the speed of your shutter, how long that shutter is actually open, is directly going to affect whatever is moving in your images and how that movement comes across in that image. So really, as long as you know that if you can match the shutter speed, make it the same or greater than whatever is moving in your image, you're going to arrest that motion. You're going to stop it. You're going to freeze it. And then once you can freeze it, you can back it off from there and literally dial in any degree of motion that you want in whatever is moving in your picture. I hope that made sense. It's very quick, it's very easy. Shutter time is nothing to be afraid of. And as you know, here at Straight Talk on Photography, I am all about giving things away. And since this video is on shutter speed, I thought, why not give away a variable neutral density filter from the folks over at K&F Concept. If I'm not mistaken, this neutral density filter dials in anywhere from 1 to around 8 stops of darkening effect. So cool little filter. Hey, it's not the best one in the world, but it is free, and free is pretty good. So if you got anything out of this video, please do like and subscribe, and I will enter you into the contest to win that variable neutral density filter from K&F Concept. Speaking of that, another reason you're going to want to subscribe is because in the next few days I have a video coming up on Tamron's brand new 28 to 75 millimeter f2.8 lens for Sony, wait for it, full frame mirrorless cameras. I've been wanting to get my hands on that lens for quite a while, and I am actually using it right now to film this very video. It's super nice, super sweet, sharpness is amazing, and I'm going to talk all about it in that video coming up in the next few days. Don't miss out. Until then, this has been Adam for Straight Talk on Photography, and I'll see you next time.